Okay, so module 2, let's talk about how to set up a recovery coordinating group. And in this context, to be clear, we're not talking about an individual organization's recovery. We're talking about recovery to deal with the wider consequences of an emergency. So, by definition, requiring a multiple set of partners coming together to organize and structure the way that they're going to deal with those consequences. And the first step, of course, is agreeing what that coordinating group might look like and where it would fit. Just to remind you, within the model that we've shared with you in the previous modules, we're very much talking about number 2 here, how to set up a recovery coordination group. And the next few slides will take you through various steps that will help you think ahead. Duncan?
Great. So obviously the chairperson and members of the recovery coordination group are absolutely key. And what we've seen is that the chairperson tends to be from an organisation that is very much focused on community development. So that might be local government, but it's somebody who really understands what the impact and needs assessment means on the ground. Obviously, this person needs some leadership skills, as you would expect from a senior member of local government. They need to understand statutory requirements, but they might get some support from project management to provide that. They need to be able to form and expand strategic partnerships and really be good at relationship building, because it's not about command and control, it's about building relationships, it's about coordination and communication. But as we've seen during COVID, they need to have personal endurance that will really survive the response and the recovery of the response to the crisis. David, but there needs to be members and they need to have slightly different responsibilities and involvement.
Yeah, and we think it's really important that you have local strategic leads from all partners responsible either for resilience, community infrastructure, environment. Obviously depends on the nature of the disaster or the emergency, but it's really important that those people are able to commit resources and or funding on behalf of their organization. It will become very clunky, very difficult if each time, a decision is sought, people have to go back into organizations to seek clarification. So the choice of these strategic leads, we think, is pretty critical. We also think it's really important that the whole group is supported either through project management approach, program management approach, or indeed what we call strategic recovery advice, subject matter experts, if you like, who understand the legislation, the legal basis for recovery arrangements in your particular country, who can advise accordingly on how best to do this and where to get support from. Thank you, Duncan.
So this next slide really just gives you some examples. It doesn't aim to tell you who should be in RCG. It just suggests that, yeah, you'll have a local government chair, perhaps. You'll have various other organisations represented. It's important that Blue Lights might be there, finance, transport, national government might have representation there to bring a national perspective. Media and communications are absolutely central so that the messages from RCG are communicated out. But also that because we're talking about potentially co-production, there needs to be representation there of other parts of society. Voluntary organisations, adult services, children's services can all bring different perspectives back into RCG, just like other local government layers that are all able to represent and talk on behalf of their communities. And so it might be that you're not having individual members of the public represented, but they are represented through the other services that connect out to them, and they're able to bring their voice and amplify that into RCG.
One of the most important things to do, I guess, is to agree a terms of reference for this group from the very beginning. Before it starts its work, the group really does need to agree whether they have a common understanding of exactly what has occurred in the emergency or the disaster. Talk about their understanding of the language of some of the concepts we've shared with you, Recovery and Renewal, so they understand exactly which phase they're in. Talk about training if there's a need to bring members up to speed for their knowledge or their understanding of their roles. Right the way through to the way that you might support them through working groups, thematic groups that will deliver some of the objectives set out. And Duncan's already mentioned the media and communication strategy being core to that. But if we look at the terms of reference in the ISO, we were very careful to lay out what we think is a model set of terms of reference for this kind of multi-agency group. So, a document that describes in fairly clear terms the aims of recovery. So what are the objectives? What are the outcomes that are commonly shared and desired? You know, what's the constitution of the group itself? How would it be governed? How does it work? How does it operate? You know, what are the duties it has under legislation within whichever country you're operating, and then the kind of basic reporting and daily management structures for how information is shared downwards, outwards, and upwards indeed across. Right the way through to being quite clear about when you think the job is done, when the task has been completed, and exactly how to exit away from recovery and back into business as usual. So we hope you'll find those of use to you in the ISO and also as part of the modules. Thanks, Duncan.
What I've just realised, David, is I haven't explained it. This number up here, 2.3, means that if you go into the ISO, then you'll find that paragraph or clause 2.3 will talk about the terms of reference.
Yeah. Okay.
And we'll provide a little bit more detail. So it's a direct way of correlating what we're talking about with what's in that document.
Yeah, good reminder.
So some examples of objectives for recovery. We think that it's all about assuring preparedness. We've talked about that already, that recovery is about making sure that you're prepared for the next crisis, for the next emergency. So that means reinstating services. It means reviewing the impact and needs assessment so that you can understand what has been impacted, what are the needs that have existed before the crisis, and understand those so that you're able to develop a plan. And developing the plan, the next objective here on the slide. That plan can help to think about how do we return back to what we've experienced before the crisis? How do we retain some aspects that we want to keep because they are changes that we've made during the crisis that we think are worthy of keeping? How do we resist some of the challenges? How do we renovate and change things to move into this new state that we want to? And what sorts of things do we recommend to the renewal? It might not be the job of RCG to progress renewal, but it will be their job to make recommendations to a renewal group if that exists. And so moving on, some of the other things is about supporting implementation of recovery. So helping people who are recovering their own organisation to find resources, to support communications, identify best practice and provide them with support of lessons learned. And really thinking about the exit strategy. How do you hand over a process, not only from recovery to renewal, but how do you close down this recovery activity as well? So these are just some of the objectives that RCG might identify for its recovery process.
And then initiating some of the work of the RCG. You know, we already discussed that we believe that recovery can start whilst response continues. Certainly the thinking about recovery, you know, the reflections on what we think is happening, where the priorities might lie. So the first role we think is to establish some clear criteria to take over from the response phase. And that might include considerations about whether the crisis is now contained or whether indeed there's any significant risk of it reoccurring that you can foresee into the future. Certainly that the environment is now safe to operate in. There's no significant risk of harm or public safety concerns, that the RCG itself is ready to set up and take on its responsibilities. So the people are in place, the information, the infrastructure, the support, for example, and also that you have the ability to connect into neighbouring RCGs or indeed national, subnational levels who could be available to support you. Key to all of this, though, we think is a really good understanding of the situation on the ground at the point where response handed over to recovery. And we do recommend in the ISO a fairly formal process for doing so, not only for an audit trail, but to encourage the kind of professional handover from one phase to the other.
One of the other responsibilities perhaps of RCG could be to identify where resources are available for recovery and renewal. Obviously, resources for response might be found more easily than resources for recovery, because the nature of the emergency has changed and has moved into a new phase. So RCG should look for where resources are available. Where are there existing local resources? So maybe current budgets being used differently. Where there are national resources, some grants coming through that might be able to provide support. Where philanthropic organisations might be willing to invest and to accomplish their aims. Charities and other community sources, but really it's about understanding where are the resources and trying to tap into some of those so that the important activities within recovery can be supported, and then starting to lay foundations for renewal initiatives.
And communicating, of course, with wider, broader interested parties is key to this as well. So a communications plan that's consistent, agrees a message from all partners to both internal and external audiences, and actually, monitor progress of how that communication is delivered. Two-way communication, and we think elected members here, officials, local government members, councillors, for example, local MPs, are critical to be involved in the process of thinking through recovery and renewal in particular. Coordinated by communications professionals seems an obvious thing to say, but given that it's a multi-agency group, clearly agreeing who may take the lead on that is a useful first step. And then engaging with affected communities, those most affected or disproportionately affected by the disaster or the emergency, we think is very important. It can be done through a number of mediums, be that direct consultation, surveying, for example, or listening, tapping into normal community representatives to gain their views.
So I can't help but feel that this module seems very simple and straightforward. You set up a group and you establish terms of reference. But David, it's almost been one of the most challenging aspects of this. We've seen local governments doing extremely well and some really struggling to get around some of the politics around establishing RCG.
We have, but I think the main lesson, or one of the main lessons from COVID, is the point where people understand that focusing in on those who have been affected by the disaster rather than the pre-existing structures has helped to galvanize, I think, people's their approach to it, and has helped people to see coming together is the only way to systematically approach some of those pre-existing and now exacerbated problems that society faces.
Yeah, absolutely. So that is really all we want to say around setting up RCG. In the following module, we will talk about impact and needs assessment, and as David said, some of the really trying to understand where those needs are in society. Before we finish though, we'd just like to leave you with some questions that you might want to think about, that you might want to ponder around RCG. So in your RCG, what partners are missing? Who's around the table? But importantly, who's not around the table? And what is their appetite for renewal? Is this about recovery and recovery only, or is it also about renewal? These might seem very obvious questions, but they're all, again, challenging questions that will really get to the root of what agency does RCG actually have to be able to complete its work, and what is the work and what the terms of reference need to involve. We also have some questions for some other parts of this diagram, but we'll talk about those when we reach those modules. David.
Okay, that's it. Thank you for listening. We'll see you in the next module.
Thank you.